The snow fell in soft, heavy flakes, like a blanket that covered the small, quiet town in a silent embrace. Christmas had always been a time of joy, a time for families to gather and for hearts to be full. But for Lily Carter, the holiday season had become nothing more than a reminder of her own solitude. She was used to the silence by now, the emptiness of the house that had once been filled with the laughter of her children and the warmth of her husband. But this Christmas, something inside her whispered that she needed to do something different. Lily stood at the window of her small kitchen, gazing out at the winter wonderland beyond. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that there was someone out there who needed help, someone who could use a little kindness in a world that sometimes felt cold and unforgiving. It was strange the way thoughts could shape actions when you weren't expecting them. And in that moment, Lily knew what she had to do. She turned from the window, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She went to the kitchen, her eyes landing on the turkey she had spent hours preparing the night before. There were mashed potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and even a fresh loaf of bread. It wasn't much, but it was enough for her. Still, she couldn't help but feel the urge to share. She thought of the elderly man who lived a few houses down, Mr. Alistair Wren. A widow just like her. He had lived on this street for years, but lately she hadn't seen him outside. People said he was in his 90s, though no one could quite remember when he had moved here. Lily had always admired him from afar. There was a quiet dignity about him, something that made him seem larger than life despite his frailty. He never seemed to ask for anything, but he had always been there, a presence that lingered in the background. When her husband had passed away, it was Mr. Wren who had been the one to shovel her driveway during the winter storms. There had been no fanfare, no words exchanged, just a small, kind gesture that meant the world at the time. Today, as the snow continued to fall outside, Lily decided to bring him a Christmas dinner. She didn't know if he'd accept it, but she couldn't bear the thought of him sitting alone as she did on this special day. She quickly wrapped the food in a cloth and grabbed a tray, her heart pounding in her chest as she stepped out the door into the crisp, cold air. The streets were empty, save for a few cars parked along the road. The town had a peaceful, almost magical quality to it, like something out of a storybook. As Lily made her way toward Mr. Wren's house, she couldn't help but wonder what he was doing at that very moment. Was he alone? Had he received any visitors? Or had he resigned himself to the silence, just like she had? She reached his front door and paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The house looked quiet, with only a faint light glowing from the window. She raised her hand to knock, but before her knuckles could make contact with the wood, the door creaked open. There, standing in the doorway, was Mr. Wren. His eyes were tired, and his face was lined with age and sorrow. Yet, there was a soft warmth in his gaze that made Lily's heart swell with empathy. "Mr. Wren," she said softly, smiling, "I brought you some dinner. I thought you might like a little company today." He blinked, surprised, before his lips curled into a faint smile. "Lily, that's kind of you. But you didn't have to." "I know," she said with a shrug. "But I figured no one should be alone on Christmas. It's just a small gesture." He stepped aside to let her in, and she followed him into the small, dimly lit hallway. The house was cozy, filled with the scent of old wood and the faint trace of something burning in the fireplace. It wasn't grand, but it had character. She could tell it had been well loved at least once upon a time. "Please make yourself comfortable," Mr. Wren said, his voice gravelly with age. Lily set the tray down on the small table in his living room and took a seat. She could see the signs of grief in his eyes, a shadow that never quite seemed to leave. She couldn't imagine the pain of losing a spouse after so many years together. Her own heart ached with the memory of her husband's sudden passing 2 years ago. "I'm not sure how to thank you," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a long time since anyone has been so kind." "Don't mention it," Lily replied. "I just wanted to make sure you didn't spend Christmas alone." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The fire crackled softly in the background, and the sound of the wind outside added to the stillness of the room. As Lily glanced around the room, she noticed something odd, a stack of unopened letters on the table. Her gaze lingered on them for a moment before Mr. Wren noticed and quickly shuffled them into a drawer. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "Just some business." Lily didn't press further. Instead, she smiled and tried to change the subject. "How's your health, Mr. Wren? Anything I can do to help?" He gave her a small, rueful smile. "I've had better days, but I'm managing. It's just the loneliness, you know? The quiet. It gets to you after a while." "I understand," she said gently. "That's why I wanted to bring you dinner. I thought we could talk even if just for a little while." They spoke for the next hour, about old memories, shared grief, and the simple joys of life that sometimes got buried in the rush of time. For the first time in a long time, Lily felt a sense of peace settle over her. It was the kind of companionship she hadn't realized she was missing. But then, just as the clock struck 5, there was a knock at the door. Mr. Wren's face fell. Lily's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be at this hour? Before either of them could speak, the door opened and a man in a sharp suit stepped inside. His presence was sudden and imposing, and he barely acknowledged either of them as he walked in. "Mr. Wren, I'm here to speak with you about the matter we discussed," the man said, his voice cold and formal. He turned toward Lily and gave her a quick, assessing glance. "And you must be the woman who thought it appropriate to interfere." Lily stood, her pulse racing. I don't understand. What's going on?" The lawyer didn't answer her directly. Instead, he turned to Mr. Wren. "I'm afraid we have some legal matters to address, Mr. Wren. You've been delayed in addressing them." "Legal matters?" Lily repeated, confused. "What's going on, Mr. Wren? You didn't say anything about this." The elderly man looked uncomfortable, his hands trembling slightly. "Lily, I didn't mean for you to get involved." Just then, the lawyer stepped forward, pulling a thick envelope from his briefcase and handing it to Mr. Wren. "I have the necessary documents here. You've got a deadline, Mr. Wren, and I trust you know what's at stake." Lily's mind raced, her heart pounding. She felt a sudden, deep unease. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a simple Christmas visit. Could an elderly man like Mr. Wren possibly have gotten tangled up in that involved legal action? She had always thought of him as a private, almost solitary man, but never one to be involved in something that could bring such serious consequences. Her heart went out to him. Something was clearly wrong, and he wasn't the kind of person who would ever ask for help. "Mr. Wren," Lily said softly, her eyes on the frail man across from her, "what's going on? What's all this about?" He didn't look up at her immediately. He was too focused on the papers in his hands, which now seemed to have taken on a life of their own. Lily could see his lips moving, but no words came out. He was too embarrassed, too overwhelmed to speak. The lawyer, however, took the opportunity to interject again. "There are certain assets that need to be managed. A few mistakes have been made in the past that now require attention. Mr. Wren was once a wealthy man, far wealthier than he lets on. But now the situation is urgent. He is facing debts that are simply too large to ignore." Lily's mind went numb. She had never suspected anything like this. The thought of Mr. Wren, of the man who had so often been a quiet, steady fixture in the neighborhood, being involved in something as complicated as debt and legal obligations was almost too much to comprehend. "Mr. Wren," Lily said again, this time with more urgency, "please tell me what's going on. What kind of debts are we talking about?" For the first time since the lawyer had arrived, Mr. Wren looked up. His eyes were wet, his expression full of shame. I didn't want anyone to know," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I thought I could handle it on my own. But I was wrong. I never thought it would come to this." Lily felt a lump rise in her throat. She could see now the fear in his eyes, the same fear that had paralyzed him in his chair. He wasn't just an elderly man being taken advantage of by a soulless lawyer. He was someone who had spent years carrying a burden alone, never asking for help, never even hinting at the truth. And now that truth was spilling out, unraveling in front of her. How could this happen? Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped closer to Mr. Wren, as though her proximity might offer him some kind of comfort in the midst of the chaos. The lawyer, standing near the doorway with his arms folded, finally spoke again. Mr. Wren was once involved in an investment venture, something that seemed promising at the time. But in the years that followed, it turned into a disastrous affair. There were losses, bad decisions, and ultimately the debt kept piling up. It was all supposed to be handled quietly, discreetly. But things don't stay hidden forever, do they? Lily's heart sank. A bad investment? Was that all it took to bring someone like Mr. Wren to this point? It seemed so absurd, so unfair. Here was a man who had led a simple life, never asking for anything, and now he was drowning in something he could never have predicted. And what does this have to do with me? Lily demanded, a little sharper now. She wasn't going to let Mr. Wren suffer alone, not when she had already involved herself in his life. The lawyer eyed her with disdain once again. I'm afraid your little Christmas gesture has made things more complicated than they needed to be. You've brought food into his home, you've shown kindness to a man who was hoping to keep his affairs private. Now there's an expectation that you are involved. You've made yourself a witness to something that is far from innocent. Lily's blood ran cold. What do you mean by that? His debts are not just financial, the lawyer said slowly, savoring the moment. They're also tied to some very important people. People who do not take kindly to any interference. The moment you walked in here with that food, you became a part of the situation. And that complicates things considerably. Lily's mind was spinning. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't known that by simply trying to bring a little warmth into someone's life, she could inadvertently find herself entangled in something so dangerous. She looked at Mr. Wren, who was staring at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. He seemed smaller now, defeated. "Mr. Wren," she said quietly, taking his hand in hers. "We'll figure this out. I'll help you whatever it takes." But the lawyer's voice cut through the air, sharp as a blade. "I wouldn't be so sure about that," he said coldly. "There are consequences for getting involved in something you don't fully understand. And those consequences will follow you, whether you like it or not." The door slammed behind him, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Lily stood there, holding Mr. Wren's hand, her mind racing. There were so many questions, so many unanswered truths. But one thing was clear. This Christmas the stakes were much higher than either of them had ever anticipated. The weight of the lawyer's words hung in the air like a thick fog. Lily stood there for what felt like an eternity, holding Mr. Wren's hand, both of them in a fragile silence. The suddenness of the man's departure left the air heavy with unspoken dread. Her mind was awash with questions, none of which made sense. Who were these people the lawyer had mentioned? Why did they want to intimidate Mr. Wren like this? And what kind of mess had he really gotten himself into? She tried to shake the feeling that something much darker was lurking just beneath the surface, but it clung to her, cold and unrelenting. Her eyes shifted to the unopened envelope that lay on the coffee table. The legal papers that the lawyer had left behind, a reminder of the storm that was about to break. She knew she couldn't leave them there, not without understanding exactly what they contained. She needed answers. And more than that, she needed to help Mr. Wren, whose quiet grief had transformed into something far more dangerous. "I'm going to take a look at these," she said to him, her voice firm despite the nerves that prickled under her skin. Mr. Wren didn't stop her. In fact, he seemed too defeated to protest. The defiance she had seen in him earlier, that quiet dignity, had been replaced by a kind of resigned surrender. He looked so old, so frail, in that moment that Lily wondered how much more he could take before the weight of his secrets crushed him completely. Lily carefully opened the envelope, her hands trembling. She pulled out a series of papers, each one more complicated than the last. The words blurred together as she scanned through the documents. Contractual terms, financial records, names of companies she didn't recognize. Her eyes skimmed over phrases like defaulted loan, assets seized, legal action pending. She understood enough to know that these weren't just small, manageable debts. This was an avalanche, a disaster that could bury Mr. Wren and anyone who dared to get too close. But it was the last page that stopped her cold. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the name at the bottom of the document. Wren and Sons Holdings. She hadn't realized until that moment. Mr. Wren hadn't always been the quiet, humble man she had known. He had once been part of something much larger, something far more powerful. The name Wren and Sons implied a family business, a legacy. But the papers before her told a different story, one of corruption, hidden deals, and the kind of wealth that could attract dangerous enemies. The debts weren't just a product of bad investments, they were part of something far more complex, a network of people with enough power to make or break lives. Lily's eyes darted back to Mr. Wren, who seemed to be unraveling before her. His face was ashen and his lips trembled. "I never meant for you to get involved," he whispered again, his voice barely audible. "It's too dangerous. You don't understand, you don't know who I was." The words hung in the air like a confession, like a truth that had been hidden for years, buried beneath layers of shame and regret. Lily stared at him, shocked. "Who were you?" she asked softly, her voice strained with the sudden weight of the revelation. Mr. Wren's gaze fell to the floor, as though the ground had become the only thing he could trust in that moment. He shook his head slowly. "I was someone who thought he could have it all," he said, his voice thick with regret. "But greed made me forget the things that really mattered. And now I've lost it all." Lily felt her heart twist. She had no idea. She had assumed Mr. Wren was just a simple, lonely man trying to live out his remaining years in peace. But he wasn't. Not anymore. The man sitting before her had once been part of something that spanned continents, wealth, power, and influence. And he had watched it all slip through his fingers, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the skeleton of a once great empire. "What happened?" Lily asked, her voice gentle now. She couldn't bear to see him like this. He didn't look up, his face pinched with pain. It was a business, a family business. My sons, he paused, his voice cracking. They're gone now. Both of them. And when they were gone, everything started to fall apart. The debts mounted. The deals that seemed like opportunities at the time became chains pulling me down. Lily sat quietly, letting the weight of his words settle in. She had heard rumors, of course, about Wren and Sons Holdings, but nothing that connected it to Mr. Wren. The name was known to the older generation. Some whispered it had once been tied to international shipping, to oil, to real estate. But no one had dared to speak of it openly. And no one had ever mentioned it in connection with the elderly man who lived just down the street. To think that Mr. Wren was connected to something so enormous, so far-reaching, it was hard to grasp. The lawyers, the ones who came to your door, Lily said slowly, the pieces of the puzzle starting to click together. They're not just after money, are they? They want something else. He nodded, his gaze distant. They don't just want my money, Lily. They want everything I built. They want control. And if I don't play their game, they'll take everything from me, from anyone who's ever had anything to do with me. Lily's stomach twisted. She realized with a cold certainty that this wasn't just about Mr. Wren's debts anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that could reach into her own life as well. She had become part of the story whether she wanted to or not. At that moment, Lily heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching on snow outside the window. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Someone was outside. It was too late for more visitors, too late for another lawyer to show up. But there was no mistaking the car. She recognized it immediately. Mr. Wren, we have to go, she said urgently, standing up from her seat. They're coming. He looked up at her, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. Who's coming? Lily didn't answer. Instead, she rushed to the window, peeking through the blinds. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw the black car parked outside, the one she had seen earlier with the lawyer. But this time there were two figures standing outside. One of them was the same man, the lawyer. The other was a woman. Tall, imposing, and dressed in black from head to toe. And in that instant, Lily knew that everything was about to change. Whatever had been set in motion by the lawyer's visit had now escalated into something she wasn't prepared for. The stakes had been raised. There was no turning back. Lily's heart raced as she pulled away from the window. The air in the room had become stifling, oppressive, as though the very walls were closing in on her. The sound of her breath seemed louder than ever, each inhale a desperate attempt to gather her thoughts. Mr. Wren, still sitting frozen in his chair, didn't move. His eyes were wide, his face pale as a ghost. He could sense the danger too. He could feel the weight of it bearing down on them both. Lily didn't wait another second. She grabbed Mr. Wren by the arm and pulled him up, her strength surprising even herself. The elderly man stumbled slightly, his legs shaky, but she steadied him, her voice calm despite the panic rushing through her veins. We need to leave now, she said urgently. Mr. Wren opened his mouth to protest, but he hesitated. He was clearly torn, caught between a lifetime of pride, secrecy, and the terrifying reality of what was now at his doorstep. But Lily could see it in his eyes. He was too scared to stay. And so, without another word, he let her guide him toward the back door, his frail body leaning heavily on hers for support. The snow had thickened outside, blanketing everything in a heavy, silencing layer. The darkness had descended on the street like a curtain, but Lily knew they couldn't go far. The car was already parked in front of the house, and she could see the faint outline of the woman in black, standing still in the cold, her silhouette like some kind of predator waiting for her prey. Lily's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. She had no plan, no clear idea of what to do, but she had to act. They had to get away, even if just for a little while, to regroup, to buy some time. She had no idea who these people were or what they wanted, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let them get their hands on Mr. Wren, or on her. They reached the back gate of the property, and Lily hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. The cold night air hit them with a sharp bite, and she pulled Mr. Wren with her down the narrow alley between the houses, keeping to the shadows. They were going to the alley behind the neighboring row of houses, the one that led out into the open woods behind the town. It wasn't a perfect escape route, but it was their only chance. They were halfway down the alley when the sound of footsteps, heavy, purposeful, echoed from the front of the house. Lily's heart lurched. They were coming. They had to move faster. Suddenly, a voice rang out in the distance, sharp and authoritative. We know you're there, Mr. Wren. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Lily's blood ran cold. The woman's voice was laced with an icy certainty, as though she had already won. She felt the panic creeping in again, but there was no turning back now. "Keep going," Lily urged, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "We can't stop." But just as they reached the end of the alley, a car screeched to a halt in front of them. Lily turned in horror, only to see a sleek, black vehicle blocking their path. The driver's side window rolled down, and the same lawyer from before, cold and unsympathetic, leaned out. "Mr. Wren," the lawyer called, his voice taunting. "This is the end of the line." Lily's heart thundered in her chest. She had no weapon, no means of defending herself or Mr. Wren. She was trapped. There was nowhere left to run. But then, just as the lawyer began to step out of the car, another voice, this one calmer, more authoritative, cut through the night. "Hold on." The voice belonged to the woman from the front yard. She stepped into view, her silhouette sharp and controlled against the night sky. She was tall, with short, cropped hair, dressed in dark, expensive clothing that blended perfectly with the shadows. The lawyer stopped in his tracks, his face instantly tightening with unease. "What are you doing here?" The woman's eyes flicked to Lily and Mr. Wren for just a moment before focusing back on the lawyer. "This isn't your call, Michael. Step aside." Lily's mind raced. She had no idea who this woman was or what role she played in all of this. But the way the lawyer recoiled at her words, like a dog being put in its place, was enough to give Lily some hope. Whoever she was, she clearly held power over the situation. "Are you the one behind all this?" Lily demanded, her voice sharp with growing frustration. "What do you want with Mr. Wren?" The woman's gaze flicked to her, assessing, but there was no malice in her eyes, just a kind of tired calculation. "I'm here to fix things, not make them worse." Lily blinked, trying to process what was happening. "Fix things?" she repeated, disbelief lacing her tone. "You're here to make everything right?" The woman nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Wren is tied up in something far bigger than he ever realized. But now that it's all come to light, I'm going to help him get out of it. His past has caught up with him, but it doesn't have to end in disaster. There's a way out, if we play it right." Lily looked at Mr. Wren, who had been silent the entire time. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of redemption. "And you?" Lily asked, her voice softer now. "Who are you?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked up to Mr. Wren, giving him a nod of recognition. "I used to work for the family," she said simply. "I'm here to clean up the mess, and that includes ensuring that no one gets hurt in the process. But you," she added, turning her gaze to Lily, "might have just made all the difference. By showing kindness when you didn't have to, you've given him something no one else could. Hope." The lawyer, Michael, opened his mouth to protest, but the woman silenced him with a single, cold look. "Go back to your masters, Michael. This is over." The woman turned and started walking toward the car, giving Lily and Mr. Wren a final glance. "Come on," she said. "We have work to do." Lily stood there for a long moment, processing everything that had just happened. The cold, the fear, the uncertainty, it all seemed to vanish in that single moment. She wasn't sure what kind of future lay ahead for her or Mr. Wren, but for the first time that day she felt a sliver of hope. She took Mr. Wren's arm once more and followed the woman into the car. It was time to face the consequences, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for a new beginning. Epilogue. Weeks passed, and the details of the legal battle were settled quietly. Mr. Wren's debts were renegotiated, the business dismantled, and the dangerous figures from his past were held at bay. Lily didn't know all the details, nor did she care to. But she knew that she had played a part in something much larger than herself. She had shown kindness when it was needed most, and in return she had helped save a man from a lifetime of secrets and regrets. And as for Mr. Wren, the quiet man who had once been so full of pride and sorrow, he found peace once again, this time not alone, but with a friend who had dared to reach out when no one else had.